Off a gravel road in Vershire, Vermont, on a hillside that looks like ordinary green mountain forest, there is a patch of ground where nothing grows. A brook runs through it. The brook has no fish in it. It has no insects. It has almost no life of any kind. Its water tests, in places, at a pH close to the acidity of table vinegar. Along its banks, the trees stand at a polite distance. The soil is a rusty orange in places and glittering black in others, and it is scattered with pieces of slag that catch the light like broken glass. If a person walks 100 yards up the slope from the brook into what looks at first like second-growth hardwood forest, they will begin to notice the cellar holes. They are shallow. Most of them are choked with fallen leaves and young trees. A stone doorstep here, a broken chimney base there. The rectangular footprint of a boarding house, or a general store, or a Methodist church. There is no sign at the road. There is no historical marker. There is no obvious reason, to a person who did not know what they were looking at, to stop. But on this hillside, in the late 1800s, there was a town of nearly 2,000 people. There were more than 150 buildings. There was a general store and a post office. There was a boarding house district for the immigrant miners. There were 2 churches, one Catholic and one Methodist. There was a company office and a company store and a company school. And there was, at the top of the hill, one of the largest and busiest copper mines in New England. The town's name, for a few years in the late 1870s, was Ely. Before that and after that, it was Copperfield. The mine at the top of the hill was owned by a family from New York named Ely, and the family renamed the village after itself while its fortunes were rising, and the village renamed itself back to Vershire when the family's fortunes fell. By 1907, the buildings were being sold at auction. Some of them were disassembled on the spot. Others were moved, whole, by teams of horses, down the road toward Lake Fairlee. The miners had already left. Most of them had left years before. By the middle of the 20th century, the forest had swallowed the rest. And that is roughly where the story sat for about 100 years, remembered by a few local historians and the descendants of miners, unmarked by the state, uncatalogued by the wider world, until the Environmental Protection Agency knocked on the door. This is the record of what stood on that hillside. This is the record of what happened when the miners stopped getting paid, and what the governor of Vermont sent up the road to answer them, and what the auctioneers moved, and what the forest was left to take. And this is the record of what a team of archaeologists is finding in the ground there now, one test pit at a time, before the federal cleanup crews come in and turn the whole hillside over. Because the records don't lie. And in this case the records are hiding in plain sight, in the cellar holes and the auction ledgers and the county newspapers and the memories of the grandchildren of men who used to walk out of that mine at the end of a 12-hour shift. You just have to be willing to walk into the trees to read them. The site sits on about 350 acres of what is now private timberland off Beanville Road in the town of Vershire in Orange County, Vermont. The larger property runs to about 1,800 acres. It is owned today by 2 forestry corporations. It is managed as commercial timberland. The Environmental Protection Agency arrived in 2001 and formally designated the site an EPA Superfund cleanup priority. The pollution the agency was worried about is not a modern industrial pollution. It is a 19th century one. When copper ore containing sulfur is exposed to air and water, it produces sulfuric acid. The old mine works, the tailings piles, the roasting beds where ore used to be baked before smelting, all of them have been leaking acid into the local watershed for well over 100 years. That acid has poisoned Ely Brook and Schoolhouse Brook. Both of them, in modern testing, contain no fish and effectively no aquatic life. The federal cleanup projected for the site is estimated at up to $28 million. Before that cleanup could begin, however, federal law required something else to happen first. Under the National Historic Preservation Act, any federally funded ground disturbance at a site of potential historical significance has to be documented archaeologically before the earth movers arrive. The Ely mine site qualified. In May of 2023, a rotating team of about 10 archaeologists arrived at the property. They set up test pits. They began to dig. They were led by Dr. Jess Robinson, the Vermont state archaeologist, in cooperation with the Northeast Archaeology Research Center. A historical consultant hired by the EPA, Matt Kierstead, was on site to explain the mine's significance to visitors and the local press. The team stayed on site through October. What they were digging was, in the strict sense, a domestic site. The mine itself has been documented for decades. The industrial features on the site, the roasting beds and the tramways and the shaft heads, are visible in period photographs and in surviving engineering drawings. What has not been well documented is the village. What has not been well documented is how the people who worked the mine actually lived. That is what the test pits are answering, one small find at a time. Fragments of tableware, bits of costume jewelry, clay tobacco pipes, buttons, broken glass from patent medicine bottles. The kind of everyday material that never makes it into an official mining report, but that tells an archaeologist, with more precision than any newspaper account, what the people of Copperfield actually spent their money on and what their evenings actually looked like. The finds have surprised the excavators in a small but consistent way. They had expected, based on the standard 19th century industrial story, to find evidence of grinding poverty. What they are finding instead is evidence of a working population that, in its off hours, dressed reasonably well, ate off decent dishes, and enjoyed a smoke. Dr. Robinson has been careful, in interviews with the local press, not to overclaim. The domestic archaeology is not a substitute for the labour history. The labour history is grim, and the labour history is well documented. But the domestic archaeology fills in a piece that the labour history has always missed. It shows the people, off shift, being people, to understand how they got there in the first place, and how the whole town would come apart within 20 years of its founding. It helps to go back to the very beginning of the story. The copper under the hill was first noticed, according to local tradition, in the 1820s. The tradition varies in its details, as founding stories from that era tend to. In one version, a farmer noticed a rock that his oxen's shoe had scuffed to reveal an unusual colour underneath. In another, a girl walking in the rain sank her foot into a soft patch of ground and pulled it out orange. In a third, a farmer walking his land noticed a burnt-looking outcrop 400 feet above the valley floor that was reported to give off strange smoke and flashes of light. What is documented in newspapers of the time is that by the 1820s there was serious commercial interest in what lay under a hill in Vershire called Dwight Hill, and by the early 1830s small-scale copper extraction was underway. What was being mined, in the first instance, was not exactly what a modern reader would recognize as copper. Vermont's copper deposits are what a geologist would call massive sulfide ores. They contain copper, but they also contain iron and a great deal of sulfur. And in the early 19th century, the sulfur was often the more commercially interesting product. Sulfur ore of that kind, roasted and processed, produces a chemical called iron sulfate. In the 19th century, that chemical was known as copperas, and it was in enormous industrial demand. The tanning industry used it, the textile industry used it for dyeing wool. Small quantities were used in medicine and in ink. It was a bulk industrial chemical for a bulk industrial century, and the deposits under Dwight Hill contained a great deal of it. For decades, that is what the mine actually produced, not the copper as. The Vermont copper belt as a whole, in fact, was built on this. The three mining districts of Orange County, the Ely mine at Vershire, the Elizabeth mine at Stratford, and the Pike Hill mines at Corinth all followed roughly the same pattern. Discover the sulfide deposits in the early 1800s, extract iron sulfate for the industrial market, wait for copper prices to rise. Then, in a series of pulses driven by wars and by shifts in metals demand, extract the copper as well. Of the three sites, the oldest and the longest lived was the Elizabeth mine at Stratford. It was first worked in 1793 on Copper's Hill by two brothers named John and Robert Ely, and it ran on and off for 165 years. Its greatest years came after the Ely mine at Vershire was already closed. During and after the Second World War, under new operators and modern flotation milling technology, the Elizabeth mine became the largest and most productive copper mine in New England. It produced, over its entire life, more than 100 million pounds of copper. It did not close for good until 1958. The Pike Hill district in Corinth was smaller and later, but it had one of the more memorable founding stories in Vermont mining history. Its central operation, the Union Mine, was reported to have been discovered in 1847 by a fox hunter chasing a fox into its den. The animal disappeared into a crevice in the hillside, and the hunter, following it in, noticed the greenish stain of copper minerals in the rock. The Union Mine produced roughly 31,500 tons of ore over the following decades, at grades between 8 and 10% copper. The rest of the Pike Hill district followed on the same discovery, and the Ely Mine at Vershire had one more legacy worth noting before its own story picks up in earnest. When the ore was hauled down the mountain, it was loaded onto trains at a rail junction at the intersection of the modern routes 144 and Route 5. That junction was called, at the time, Ely Depot. It is still called Ely Depot today. The town changed its name back to Vershire in 1882. The depot did not. The name of the family whose mine drove the whole operation is now attached, more than 100 years after the fact, to nothing but a rural rail crossroads a few miles from the empty ground where the village used to be. That last part is important context for the Ely Mine's arc, because the Ely Mine's biggest boom, and the one that built the village of Copperfield, came during a war. The American Civil War was, among many other things, a war of copper. Copper was essential to the manufacture of brass, and brass was essential to the manufacture of shell casings and percussion caps and the fittings on nearly every piece of military machinery. When the war broke out in 1861, copper prices rose sharply. And when copper prices rose sharply, dormant 19th-century American mines that had been surviving on iron sulfate suddenly found themselves worth reinvesting in. The Ely Mine was one of them. By the mid-1860s, under the operation of a New York businessman named Smith Ely and his associates, the Vershire mine had scaled up dramatically. The Vermont Copper Mining Company was pouring capital into the operation. The workforce expanded. A village was purpose-built at the base of Dwight Hill to house the men who were now working the mine in shifts around the clock. That village, at its peak, was one of the largest industrial communities in northern New England. By the 1870s, close to 900 people were working at the mine. The village around it had a total population approaching 2,000. There were more than 150 buildings on the site. There were boarding houses for the single men, single-family houses for the miners with families, a general store, a post office, a Catholic church, a Methodist church, and a small school. In 1878, the citizens of Vershire, in a gesture that made sense at the time and would embarrass them within 5 years, voted to change the town's name to Ely in honor of the man whose company employed most of them. The workforce was largely immigrant. The bulk of the miners had come from Cornwall in the southwest of England, where the tin and copper mines that had built the Industrial Revolution were beginning to fail. Others had come from Ireland, following the same 19th-century migration that had built canal towns and mill towns across the American northeast. A small number had come from Scotland and Wales. What tied them together, at Vershire, was the accident of geography that put a large sulfide deposit under a Vermont hill at the moment when their trade was being priced out of its home ground. The work, by any modern standard, was brutal. Underground shifts ran 10 to 12 hours. The mine operated 24 hours a day. Men drilled by lamplight, hundreds of feet below the surface, blasting through hard sulfide rock with black powder. Ventilation was primitive. Falls of rock were common. Miners worked by policy in pairs because a solo miner who was injured or knocked unconscious could not expect to be found in time. That policy was called the buddy system, and it was in place because the alternative had killed too many men. The noise was severe enough that miners packed cotton into their ears before every shift. There was no other form of hearing protection. Above ground, the work was in some ways worse. The ore extracted from Dwight Hill had to be roasted before it could be smelted. Roasting a sulfide ore produces sulfur dioxide gas in large quantities. That gas, heavier than air, settled into the valley around the mine. It withered vegetation for a mile in every direction. It scorched the lungs of anyone who breathed it. A letter written by a Vershire resident in 1882 described the fumes as suffocating at times. The farmers downwind of the mine, whose crops were dying and whose livestock was sickening in the acid rain that fell out of the smoke plume, began, in the early 1880s, to file lawsuits. Those lawsuits would eventually contribute to the mine's closure. But that was still more than 20 years away. In the middle of the 1870s, the Ely Mine was one of the great industrial success stories of northern New England. In the middle of the 1880s, it would be almost gone. The transition, and it was rapid, began with a family succession. In 1876, the operation of the mine passed from Smith Ely to his grandson, a man named Ely-Goddard, who changed his surname to Ely-Goddard in what appears to have been an effort to honor the family legacy in the town that now bore its name. Ely-Goddard was a competent enough operator, but he had inherited an operation that was already showing structural problems. Copper prices, after their Civil War peak, had been falling steadily as newer and cheaper mines opened in the American West. The rich upper ore bodies at Vershire had been mostly extracted. Reaching the deeper ore required deeper shafts and more expensive equipment. The mine executives, in the belief that richer ore lay at greater depths, invested $50,000, roughly the equivalent of more than $1 million today, in new hoisting equipment. The gamble did not pay off. The company went $200,000 into debt. In 1881, Smith Ely sold his shares in the mine. Ely-Goddard, now the operator, brought in a German mining engineer named Francis Cazin, whose credentials from Western and Midwestern operations had looked impressive on paper. In practice, Cazin's tenure was, by most historical accounts, disastrous. Within 2 years, Ely-Goddard would fire him, and Cazin would sue the company, and the litigation would drag on while the mine continued to unravel. In 1882, the citizens of Vershire successfully petitioned to change the town's name back from Ely to Vershire. That vote was, in effect, a public statement of no confidence in the mine's future. When a town takes down the sign it put up in a family's honor, the family's power in that town is already gone, and by the summer of 1883, the mine's workers had not been paid in months. The events of what would come to be called the Ely War took place over the first week of July, 1883. They are, by any reasonable measure, one of the most striking labor confrontations in 19th century Vermont history, and they are documented in the county newspapers of the time in enough detail that the sequence of events can be reconstructed almost hour by hour. On June 29, 1883, mine officials posted a sign at the operation. The sign informed the workers that the company could no longer make payroll. The mine would close unless the workers accepted a substantial pay cut. The workers at that point had already gone approximately 2 months without wages. Their families could not pay for food. The company store, which had been extending credit against those unpaid wages, had reached the limit of what it was willing to carry. And now the men who had done the actual work of digging the mine were being told, in effect, that they would either work for less or not work at all. On the following Monday, July 2nd, the miners took over the mine. The exact form the takeover took varies between accounts. What is agreed is that by Monday evening, the mine buildings were under the control of the striking workers. The company executives had been effectively displaced, and some of the striking men had seized supplies of explosives from the mine's own storage. The Green Mountain Freeman, a Montpelier newspaper of the time, reported that the strikers were threatening to destroy the mine buildings if their back wages were not paid. For 3 days, the town of Vershire was under the effective control of the strikers. Word reached Montpelier. Word reached Governor John Barstow. The Green Mountain Freeman would later refer to the events as the Vershire Affair. The Burlington Free Press, in more inflammatory language, would call them the Vershire War. The state's newspapers were largely sympathetic to the miners' plight, though they hedged that sympathy with the class anxieties of their time. The Freeman warned that a crowd of ignorant men, goaded by ill usage and hunger, was, in its own words, apt to become a willing tool in the hands of the first agitator that came along. Governor Barstow, whatever his private sympathies, made a political decision. He called out the state militia. Before dawn on the morning of Saturday, July 7, 1883, roughly 200 militia members loaded into wagons and were driven from staging areas toward Vershire. Each man had been issued 20 rounds of ammunition. The written expectation, both in official orders and in the newspaper coverage of the mobilization, was that resistance would be armed and that lives would be lost. At about 7 in the morning, the militia column crested a hill above the town. Below them, Vershire looked sleepy. There was no barricade, there was no armed picket. As the militia moved slowly into the town, the men on the wagons began to notice that the miners and their families were watching from the windows of their houses. There was no gunfire, there was no confrontation, and then something happened that neither the newspapers nor the governor's office appears to have expected. The miners and their families began, cautiously, to come out of their houses. Women and children came out first, then the men themselves. They walked toward the militia not with weapons, but with, in effect, a request to be recognized. They had been hungry for a long time. They had children with them who had been hungry for a long time. Whatever fight had been in them earlier in the week had ended, it turned out, sometime in the intervening days. The militia officers ordered the arrest of 12 men identified as the ringleaders. Those 12 men were taken, without resistance, into custody. They were transported to the jail in Chelsea, the county seat. They would be released, without charges filed, 2 days later, by the state's attorney. And in the meantime, back in Vershire, something quieter had happened. The militiamen, on seeing that the crazed mob they had been called upon to suppress was in fact a group of hungry miners and their families, had, according to multiple newspaper accounts, begun distributing their own rations to the crowd. Several hours later, with the town peaceful and no shots fired, the militia loaded back into the wagons and left. The Vermont Copper Mining Company, however, was finished as an enterprise. Payroll was resumed, in part, through emergency financing. Some of the miners went back underground, many did not. The village of Copperfield began to hollow out. Families that had been in Vermont for a decade or more began to leave for other mining regions, or for the mill towns of southern New England, or for the copper strikes that were beginning to open up in Michigan and Arizona. The mine itself continued to operate in fits and starts for another 20 years. There were brief revivals when copper prices spiked. There were periods of near-total shutdown. Various operators tried to restart the works with new capital and new technology and new theories about where the good ore lay. None of them succeeded for long. Meanwhile, the lawsuits that had been filed by downwind farmers were making their way through the courts. Those farmers, whose crops had been dying and whose land was slowly being poisoned by the sulfur plume, were not going away. Their case built, slowly, over the course of the 1890s and into the early 1900s. By the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, the environmental liability was as serious a threat to the mine's operations as the exhausted ore bodies were. In 1905, the Ely mine closed for good. The Vermont Copper Mining Company was dissolved. What remained of its equipment was sold at auction, along with, over the next 2 years, the buildings of the village itself. In 1907, the auctioneers arrived in earnest. This is the part of the record that reads, in retrospect, most strangely. Whole buildings were sold as buildings, not as materials to be salvaged, though a great deal of salvage did happen, but as intact structures to be jacked up, mounted on rollers, and moved by teams of horses to new sites in the surrounding towns. The workmanship in 19th century timber frame construction made this practical. A well-built barn, or church, or house could be relocated over a distance of several miles, given enough men and enough draft animals. The house of Smith Ely himself, the man for whom the village had briefly renamed itself, was among the buildings sold. Its buyer had it moved south, several miles down the road, to a site near the northern end of Lake Fairlee, in the town of Fairlee. It stands there today. Anyone who drives past it now sees, without any indication of the fact, the private residence of the man who had built the largest copper mining operation in 19th century New England, and who had watched the militia be called out to answer his failure to pay his workers. The Methodist Church of Copperfield was also purchased and moved. It became, in its new location, the meeting hall of what would eventually be the Vershire Historical Society. It stands there today as well. The building that once held Sunday services for the miners' families is now the building in which local historians assemble the records of what happened to those families. Building by building, the village came apart. The boarding houses were sold. The single-family houses were sold. The general store and the company office were sold. Some structures were moved as noted. Others were disassembled on site, the framing lumber carted off, the stone foundations left in place. By 1910, the village of Copperfield had physically ceased to exist. What was left was the mine works themselves, which had no salvage value and no buyer, and the cellar holes of the vanished houses, which no one bothered to fill in, and the tailings piles, which no one bothered to move. And then the forest began to come back. This is the part of the story that a person walking the site today sees with their own eyes, if they know what they are looking at. The reforestation of a burnt or poisoned industrial site in the northeastern United States over the course of the 20th century is a well-documented ecological process. It takes decades. It happens in stages. Early colonizers like poplar and birch established themselves in the disturbed soil. They shade the ground for the slower hardwoods. Over 60 or 70 years, a full canopy returns. At Vershire, that canopy came back over the cellar holes. It came back over the crumbling dam that had once fed the mill pond above the village. It came back over the roasting beds where sulfur dioxide had once boiled off the ore. It came back over the stone doorsteps of houses whose walls had been carted away by their new owners. What it did not come back over, in the same way, was the ground directly downhill of the tailings piles. That ground stayed largely bare. The sulfuric acid leaching out of the waste rock continued to sterilize the soil. Ely Brook, in particular, ran orange for decades, and even today it is one of the most acidic streams in Vermont, running through a landscape that from a satellite photo looks like anywhere else in Orange County, but that on the ground is still, in slow motion, poisoned. The site sat, largely undisturbed, for about 90 years. Local historians knew it was there. The West Fairlee Historical Society and the Vershire Historical Society kept the records of the miners and their families. Retired local men led occasional walking tours of the ruins. Amateur cave explorers, curious about the old shafts, made unauthorized visits and, over the years, at least a few of them died on the property from falls or from asphyxiation in the old workings. The land itself, over that 90 years, changed hands a few times. It ended up, by the late 20th century, in the possession of two forestry corporations. It was managed for commercial timberland, and then in 2001, the EPA arrived. The Superfund designation formalized what the local streams had been telling anyone who tested them. The Ely mine was one of the worst point sources of acid mine drainage in the state of Vermont. It joined the Elizabeth mine in Stratford, which had operated until 1958, and the Pike Hill mines in Corinth, in a slow federal process of documentation, remediation and cleanup that would take in total more than 2 decades to fully organize. That process brought the archaeologists. Because federal law required historical documentation before the earth movers arrived, and because the Vermont copper belt is genuinely nationally significant, the EPA hired historical consultants and coordinated with the state archaeologist to make sure that whatever cleanup happened would not simply erase the physical evidence of what had once stood there. Dr. Robinson's team began digging in May of 2023. They worked test pits at what the archaeologists have called domestic sites, the footprints of individual houses and boarding houses within the vanished village. They worked through the summer. They stayed on site into October, and the material they pulled out of the ground told, in aggregate, a version of the story that the newspapers and the labor histories had never fully told. The people of Copperfield had worn nice things. They had eaten off decorated tableware. They had smoked pipes of a common but respectable make. They had bought costume jewelry from mail-order catalogues. They had lived, in the small hours away from the mine, lives that would not have looked entirely alien to a middle-class visitor from Burlington or Boston, and they had done it, according to the material record, all the way up until the end. That is not a rebuttal of the labor history. The labor history is real. The 12-hour shifts were real. The sulfur was real. The Ely War was real. The unpaid wages were real, and the 2 months of hunger before Governor Barstow's militia crossed the last hill were real, and the 12 men taken to Chelsea in the back of a wagon were real. But the domestic archaeology adds something the labor history could not add on its own. It adds the evenings. It adds the tobacco in the pipe at the end of the shift. It adds the buttons sewn back onto the coat before Sunday services at the Methodist church. It adds the plate that the miner's wife set on the table for dinner. It adds the fact that the people who lived in Copperfield were, at the end of every long shift underground, still people who wanted to sit down to a decent meal and dress reasonably well and enjoy a smoke. That is the record of Copperfield, not a story of a suppressed mine or a hidden second entrance or a report that anyone tried to bury. A story of a town that its own residents built up, and then, on the day the auctioneer came, took apart with their own hands and moved elsewhere. Some of what they moved is still standing. Smith Illy's house is at Lake Fairlee. The Methodist church is a historical society meeting hall. The stone foundations are in the woods off Beanville Road. The auction ledgers are in the county records. The newspapers are in the archives at the State Library in Montpelier. None of it is buried. None of it is sealed. All of it is available, in one form or another, to anyone who cares to look. The forest around the old mine is quiet most days. Ely Brook still runs orange. A team of archaeologists is still coming back, season after season, to open new test pits before the federal cleanup crews eventually turn the whole hillside over. And somewhere in the trees, under 100 years of leaf litter, sit the cellar holes of a village that once had 2 churches and a general store, and 900 miners walking out of the mine at shift change. The records don't lie. You just have to be willing to walk into the woods and read the ones that were left behind on the ground. And there are more woods than one. The Ely mine at Vershire was the middle sibling of 3. The Vermont Copper Belt, which ran along a 30-mile line of massive sulfide deposits through Orange County, was one of the largest and most productive hard rock underground metal mining districts in New England history. Between 1793 and 1958, its 3 mining districts together produced roughly 145 million pounds of copper. Not one of them still operates. All 3 are now, or are becoming, federal Superfund sites. The oldest and the longest lived of the 3 was the Elizabeth Mine, on Copper's Hill in the town of Stratford. It was first worked in 1793 by 2 brothers named John and Robert Ely, who were looking for iron and found something more valuable underneath. The mine took its name from Elizabeth Ely, John's wife. It ran on and off for 165 years. It was one of the first commercial sources of copperers in the United States. It was the site of no fewer than 9 separate copper ore smelting campaigns over the 19th and 20th centuries, and when the Ely mine at Vershire was already 50 years closed and mostly forgotten, the Elizabeth mine had its greatest years still ahead of it. During the Second World War, the federal government identified domestic copper supplies as a strategic priority. New investors moved into Stratford. Modern flotation milling equipment was installed, and between 1943 and 1958, the Elizabeth mine became the largest and most productive copper mine anywhere in New England, producing more than 90 million pounds of copper in a single sustained campaign. It finally closed in 1958 when foreign copper undercut the domestic price. Its total production, over its full life, exceeded 100 million pounds. The third district, the Pike Hill mines in Corinth, was smaller and later, but it had one of the more memorable founding stories in Vermont mining history. Its central operation, the Union Mine, was reported in the Burlington Daily Free Press to have been discovered in 1847 by a fox hunter chasing a fox into its den. The animal disappeared into a crevice in the hillside. The hunter, following it in, noticed the greenish stain of copper minerals in the rock. The Union Mine produced roughly 31,500 tons of ore at grades between 8 and 10% copper before it too was abandoned. 3 mines, 1 belt, about 145 million pounds of copper hauled out of Vermont over 165 years. And then, in the second half of the 20th century, essentially nothing. The Ely mine's own legacy, apart from the ruins in the forest and the artifacts coming out of the archaeologists' test pits, has one more thread worth following. When the copper ore was hauled down Dwight Hill and loaded onto trains for its journey to the smelters and the industrial markets of the eastern seaboard, it was loaded at a rail junction at the intersection of what are now Vermont Route 144 and United States Route 5. That junction was called Ely Depot. It is still called Ely Depot today. The town changed its name back to Vershire in 1882. The village of Copperfield was auctioned off and moved in 1907. The Ely family sold its shares and left. But the little rail crossroads a few miles from the empty ground where the mine used to be still carries, as its official geographic designation, the name of the family whose failure to make payroll brought 200 militiamen up the road at dawn on a summer morning in 1883. That is one of the odder facts about the whole story, a name that outlived, by more than a century, the enterprise it was attached to. The miners themselves also outlived Copperfield, though they had to scatter to do it. When the village hollowed out in the 1880s and 1890s, the workers and their families did not, in most cases, stay in Vermont. 19th century mining labor was a mobile trade. A skilled hard rock miner in 1890 could earn wages in Michigan, in Montana, in Arizona, in Nevada, or in the reviving mill towns of southern New England. The Cornish miners in particular, whose ancestral trade had been drilling and blasting hard rock underground, were in demand across the American West. Many of the Copperfield men went to the Keweenaw Peninsula of Upper Michigan, where the Calumet and Heckler Mining Company was, in the 1880s and 90s, the largest copper producer in the world. Others went further, to the copper boom at Butte, Montana, where the Anaconda Mining Company was building what would become for a time the largest metals operation on Earth. Still others went to Bisbee, Arizona, or to Jerome, Arizona, following the shift in American copper production westward. A smaller number stayed closer, taking work in the mill towns of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where the textile industry was still expanding. Some stayed in Vermont. A few descendants of Copperfield miners still live in Vershire and West Fairlee today. The West Fairlee Historical Society and the Vershire Historical Society have both spent decades collecting their family papers, their letters, their photographs of grandfathers who worked at the Ely, and the specific ethnic and religious character of the Copperfield community had a longer half-life than the village itself. The Cornish miners had brought with them, from Cornwall, a set of traditions that travelled anywhere their trade did. They brought the pasty, the folded pastry filled with meat and potato that a miner could carry down into the shaft in his pocket and eat one-handed by lamplight. They brought a strong Methodist chapel tradition and a habit of choral singing that persisted in every American mining town they settled in. And they brought a folk belief, older than any of the industrial economies they worked in, about small underground spirits called Tommyknockers, whose tapping in the rock could warn a miner of a coming cave-in, or could reveal a rich vein just out of reach. The Tommyknockers moved with the miners, from Cornwall to Vermont to Michigan to Montana to Arizona. Something like them, in one form or another, is still told about in old copper towns across the American West. The men who worked the Ely mine at Vershire were part of that longer migration. They were not the beginning of it, they were not the end of it. They were one working generation in a 19th century labor system that moved skilled hard rock miners around the world in pursuit of ore bodies that were, one after another, being opened and depleted at a pace never before seen in human history. The Ely mine ran for about 70 years, from the first serious commercial workings in the 1830s to the final shutdown in 1905. The Vermont copper belt as a whole ran for about 165 years. The global copper trade that both of them were part of is still, in a different form, running today. What is left of the Ely mine, on that hillside off Beanville Road, is not a story of a suppressed report. It is not a story of a hidden second entrance. It is a story of one working town, in one small mining district, in one corner of one American state, that took its own moment inside a much larger economic movement, and then, when that moment ended, took itself apart with its own hands and moved elsewhere. The forest closed over what was left. The state archaeologists are digging it back up, one test pit at a time. And the descendants of the men who walked out of that mine at the end of a 12-hour shift are, some of them, still living in Michigan and Montana and Arizona and Vermont, telling a version of the same story to their own grandchildren. The records don't lie, but they do move, and the records of the Ely mine, in the end, are not only in the cellar holes on Dwight Hill, they are also in the mine graveyards of the Keweenaw. They are in the Cornish choir traditions of Butte. They are in a name still attached to a rail crossroads at the intersection of two Vermont highways, and they are in a folded pastry carried in a coat pocket into an underground shaft that a Vermont miner in 1880 and an Arizona miner in 1910 and a Montana miner in 1930 would all have recognized without needing to be told as home.